There is something happening right now that you cannot see, cannot touch, and in the ordinary noise of daily life, cannot hear. It is not in the walls of the room around you, though in a sense it passes through them. It is not inside your body, though in a very real and measurable way, it moves through every cell you are made of. It is older than language, older than civilization, older than the first human being who ever looked up at the night sky and wondered what was out there. It is vibration. And the universe, from its outermost edge to the smallest particle of matter that science has ever identified, is made entirely of it. Most people move through their entire lives without once stopping to consider that the solid world they inhabit is not, at its most fundamental level, solid at all. The chair beneath you, the floor beneath that, the deep bedrock of the earth beneath the floor, all of it is vibrating. Every atom in every object oscillates at a specific frequency, a specific rate of movement that defines what that object is, how it behaves, and how it interacts with everything around it. This is not philosophy. This is not metaphor. This is physics, measured in laboratories, confirmed in equations that have been tested and retested for over a century. And if everything vibrates, then sound, which is itself nothing more than vibration moving through a medium, is not merely something we experience. It is something we are made of. The human body is not a passive receiver of sound. It is an active participant in it. Every organ, every bone, every strand of tissue in the body has a resonant frequency, a specific oscillation at which it functions most efficiently, most healthfully, most completely. When that resonance is maintained, the body works. When it is disrupted, the body struggles to find its way back. Ancient civilizations across the world knew this, not as a vague spiritual intuition, but as a precise and practical understanding that they encoded into their architecture, their rituals, and above all, their music. The Egyptians designed their temple chambers to amplify specific frequencies that corresponded to states of deep meditative alignment. The Greeks built their theatres with acoustic geometries so precise that a whisper at the stage could be heard in the back row without any amplification. The Vedic tradition in ancient India developed entire systems of tonal medicine, specific scales, specific intervals, specific rhythms, each associated with the healing of a different organ or organ system. And then there is the phenomenon that no conventional science course will ever teach you. When a metal plate is covered with sand and a specific frequency is played through it, the sand does not scatter randomly. It moves. It organizes itself into geometric patterns of extraordinary symmetry, mandalas, lattices, spirals, patterns that look as though they were drawn by a mathematician rather than produced by a vibrating surface. This phenomenon, called cymatics, has been demonstrated, photographed, and replicated by researchers across the world. It is not a trick, and it is not an illusion. It is simply sound doing what sound has always done, shaping the material world around it. So, here is the question that this entire story will turn on. If sound shapes reality, if specific frequencies produce specific biological effects, if ancient civilizations across the globe understood this and encoded it into their most sacred practices, then what happened to that knowledge? Where did it go? And if it was lost lost by accident? Or was it, quietly and deliberately, taken? In 1988, a biochemist named Dr. Glenn Ryan conducted an experiment that his colleagues could not explain. He had been studying the effect of different acoustic environments on human DNA, not on the person attached to the DNA, not on the brain processing the sound, but on the molecule itself, isolated in a laboratory setting. He wanted to know whether sound could affect biology at the most fundamental level possible. What he found changed the direction of his research permanently and quietly unsettled a small but significant corner of the scientific world. When human DNA was exposed to specific sound frequencies, it absorbed ultraviolet light at measurably different rates than DNA held in silence or exposed to random noise. The molecule responded. It behaved differently. Something in the vibrational environment of the sound was communicating directly with the structure of the genetic material, changing not its sequence, but its physical behavior, the way it coiled, the way it interacted with the surrounding chemical environment, the way it absorbed and released energy. The DNA was, in the most literal sense, listening. This finding was not published in a major journal. It was not picked up by science journalists or discussed in medical school curricula. It moved through the alternative research community in quiet, persistent ripples, gathering significance slowly, the way truly important discoveries often do when they arrive ahead of the frameworks needed to understand them. But it was verified. And in the decades that followed, other researchers, working independently and in different countries, began finding similar results using different methodologies. The pattern kept appearing. Sound was doing something to biology that conventional medicine had no model for. The field has a name, though most people have never heard it. Vibrational biology, sometimes called acoustic biology or sonobiology, is the study of how sound frequencies interact with living systems at the cellular and molecular level. It is an emerging science, still finding its footing in the mainstream, still fighting for the kind of institutional legitimacy that comes only when a field's findings become too consistent to dismiss. But the direction of the evidence is unmistakable. Specific frequencies produce specific, measurable, repeatable effects in living tissue. Different frequencies produce different effects. And some frequencies produce effects so remarkable that the researchers who document them tend to speak about their findings in careful, almost cautious language, as though they are aware that what they are describing sounds impossible, and they want very much to be believed. One frequency in particular keeps appearing in this research with unusual consistency. It is 528 Hz, a tone whose position in the musical scale places it between the E and F of a standard piano keyboard, though on no standard piano keyboard will you find it exactly. Researchers who have worked with this frequency have reported effects on DNA structure, on cellular repair rates, on anxiety reduction in human subjects that are not replicated by neighboring frequencies. Something about 528 Hz seems to interact with biological systems in a way that is qualitatively different from the sounds above and below it. Something about it resonates with life in a way that the molecules of living things appear to recognize. And here is where the story becomes genuinely strange, because 528 Hz is not a modern discovery. It is not a frequency that emerged from a laboratory database or a computational analysis of biological resonance. It is one of 6 specific tones that were embedded with mathematical precision in a chanting tradition practiced by Catholic monks in the monasteries of medieval Europe. A tradition that is at least 1400 years old. A tradition whose deepest musical secrets were quietly, systematically, and almost completely removed from the Western world sometime between the 11th and 13th centuries. The monks called their scale sacred. Someone, it seems, decided it was too sacred to leave in ordinary hands. History records many things. It records the rise and fall of empires, the names of generals and kings, the dates of battles and treaties, the births and deaths of philosophers and artists. It records the development of musical notation, the evolution of instruments, the changing tastes of different eras and different courts. It records the arguments between composers, the preferences of popes, the technical innovations that moved Western music from simple unison chanting to the complex harmonic architecture of Bach and Beethoven. What history does not record, or rather, what history records only in the silences between its sentences, in the things it does not say, is the moment when 6 specific tones disappeared from the Western musical tradition. There was no announcement. There was no debate, at least not one that has survived in any widely circulated text. There was no council of musicians who voted on whether to keep or remove these particular frequencies. There was no scholar of the period who wrote a treatise explaining why the original 6-tone system of sacred chanting was being replaced by something mathematically different. The change simply happened over the course of roughly 2 centuries, in the period between approximately 1050 and 1250 CE, and then the new system became so thoroughly established, so deeply embedded in the institutional practice of Western music, that within a few generations, almost no one remembered that anything had ever been different. The original system had a name. It was called the Solfeggio hexachord, a 6-tone scale whose tones carried specific syllabic designations: ut, re, mi, fa, sol, la. These names survive today. You likely learned them as a child. You may have sung them. But the frequencies those syllables were originally assigned to the precise mathematical vibrations that made the ancient system uniquely and powerfully different from any subsequent musical scale. Those frequencies do not survive in any standard instrument manufactured in the Western world. They were tuned out, gradually, institutionally, and with a thoroughness that suggests the change was not accidental. The replacement system, the one we now call equal temperament, which will be examined in detail in a later chapter, sounds similar enough to the original that an untrained ear would not notice the difference. The intervals feel familiar, the melodies work, the harmony is intact, but the specific mathematical ratios between the tones, the precise frequencies at which each note vibrates, are different in ways that matter enormously to anyone who understands what those frequencies were doing inside the percent bodies of the people who sang them and heard them. Think of it this way. Imagine a medicine that had been used for centuries in a specific formulation that produced specific healing effects. Now imagine that the formulation was quietly changed, every ingredient kept, every proportion slightly altered, and the new version placed in the same bottles with the same labels. To anyone looking at the shelf, nothing would appear different. The medicine would still look like medicine. It would still taste roughly similar, but it would no longer produce the same effects. The active component would be gone, replaced by something close enough to avoid suspicion but different enough to eliminate the result that mattered. That is, as best as the evidence allows us to determine what happened to the solfeggio frequencies. They were not destroyed dramatically. They were not burned in a public bonfire or condemned in a papal decree. They were quietly diluted, their precise mathematical identity altered, just enough to break the resonance, to sever the connection between the musical scale and the biological systems it had been designed to serve. And then the world moved on, as worlds do, into whatever came next, carrying the faint echo of something it could no longer quite remember. Long before the first concert hall was built, long before music became something that people purchased or performed for the entertainment of an audience, there was a different understanding of what sound was for. In the oldest civilizations whose records we have been able to recover, music was not an art form, it was not a luxury. It was not even, in the sense that we typically use the word, a cultural practice. It was a technology, a precision instrument for producing specific, measurable effects in the physical world and in the bodies of human beings. The Sumerians, whose civilization flourished in the river valleys of what is now Iraq, approximately 5,000 years ago, left behind clay tablets containing what musicologists have confirmed is the oldest notated music in the world. These tablets, found at the ancient city of Nippur and later at Ugarit in present-day Syria, date to approximately 1,400 BCE, though the musical tradition they document is believed to be significantly older. And when modern scholars translated and analyzed the notation on these tablets, what they found was not a collection of songs in any sense that a modern listener would recognize. The notation was closer to a formula, a precise specification of tonal relationships whose practical application appears to have been therapeutic rather than purely aesthetic. In ancient Egypt, the picture is even clearer. Researchers in the field of archaeoacoustics, the study of the acoustic properties of ancient structures, have measured the resonant frequencies of multiple Egyptian temple chambers and found that they were not acoustically neutral spaces. They were tuned. The dimensions of the rooms, the composition of the stone, the placement of columns and doorways, all of these architectural choices combine to amplify specific frequency ranges while dampening others. The frequencies that were amplified correspond, with remarkable precision, to the brainwave states associated with deep meditation, altered consciousness, and the kind of profound, receptive silence that spiritual traditions across the world describe as the prerequisite for healing and transformation. The Vedic tradition in ancient India, which gave us the oldest continuously practiced system of sacred music in the world, was explicit about the relationship between specific tones and specific biological and spiritual effects. The ragas of the classical Indian tradition, each one associated with a specific time of day, a specific emotional state, and a specific set of physiological effects, were not composed for pleasure. They were prescribed. A physician in the ancient Vedic world might prescribe a specific raga the way a modern physician prescribes a medication, because the tonal system of that tradition had been developed over centuries of careful observation of what specific sound frequencies did to the bodies and minds of those who heard them. This is the world in which the Solfeggio frequencies were born. Not a world of concert halls and music critics, but a world in which sound was understood as one of the most fundamental and powerful forces available to human beings. A force that, properly understood and properly applied, could shape consciousness, repair the body, and perhaps do things that we have not yet fully learned to measure. Around 570 BCE, on the small Greek island of Samos, a man was born who would spend his life trying to decode the mathematical language that he believed the universe had been written in. His name was Pythagoras, and the story that most people know about him, the one about the right angle and the square of the hypotenuse, is almost certainly the least interesting thing about him. What Pythagoras spent the majority of his remarkable life pursuing was not geometry. It was music. Or more precisely, it was the relationship between music and the numerical architecture of the cosmos. Before he established his famous philosophical school in the Greek colony of Croton, Pythagoras spent years studying in Egypt not as a tourist, but as a dedicated student of the Egyptian temple priests, who maintained one of the most sophisticated intellectual traditions in the ancient world. The specific content of what he learned in those temples has been the subject of scholarly speculation for 2.5 millennia, but there is strong evidence that his understanding of the mathematical ratios underlying musical harmony, the insight that would become the foundation of all subsequent Western music theory, came not from the Greek tradition, but from the ancient Egyptian one. The famous story of Pythagoras' discovery involves a blacksmith's forge. Walking past the workshop one afternoon, he noticed that different hammers striking the same anvil produced different tones, and that some combinations of those tones sounded harmonious, while others sounded discordant. He investigated, and found that the weights of the hammers stood in specific mathematical ratios to each other, that the intervals we now call the octave, the fifth, and the fourth corresponded precisely to the ratios 2:1, 3:2, and 4:3. Harmony, in other words, was mathematics made audible. The universe was not merely described by numbers. It was built from them. From this discovery, Pythagoras developed his concept of the musica universalis, the music of the spheres. This was his proposition that the planets in their orbits, moving at speeds that stood in mathematical ratios to one another, produced a constant, all-pervading cosmic harmony, a music too vast and too continuous for the human ear to detect, but whose mathematical structure was identical to the structure of earthly musical consonants. This was not poetry. Pythagoras intended it as a literal description of cosmic architecture, and his followers treated it as such. What makes this ancient speculation remarkable is what happened in 1977, when NASA's Voyager spacecraft began transmitting data from the outer solar system. Scientists converted the electromagnetic vibrations emitted by Jupiter, Saturn, and their moons into audible sound, and found that they were, in a genuinely musical sense, harmonic. The giant planets were humming. The specific frequency ratios between their electromagnetic emissions corresponded closely to the intervals of the natural harmonic series. The ancient mystic and the space agency had been measuring, across 25 centuries of separation, exactly the same phenomenon. The idea that specific numbers carry specific creative power, that the universe is not merely described by mathematics, but is, in some profound sense, made of it, runs through virtually every ancient intellectual tradition, with a consistency that is either the world's most widespread coincidence or the echo of a single, very old understanding. The Pythagorean tradition in Greece, the Kabbalistic tradition in Hebrew mysticism, the Vedic tradition in India, the sacred geometry encoded in Egyptian temple design, all of these traditions treat certain numbers, not as abstract symbols, but as active principles, each with specific properties and specific correspondences to aspects of the physical and spiritual world. Among these traditions, 3 numbers occupy a position of particular significance: 3, 6, and 9. In Pythagorean numerology, these are the numbers of completion: the triangle, the hexagon, the nonagon, the forms that recur with unusual frequency in the geometry of the natural world. In Kabbalistic tradition, they correspond to specific aspects of the divine creative process. In the Vedic system, they appear as the numerical foundation of the most powerful mantric sequences. And Nikola Tesla, that most modern and most misunderstood of scientists, became convinced in the final years of his life that 3, 6, and 9 were not merely important numbers, but the key to understanding the structure of the universe itself. He reportedly walked around buildings in multiples of 3, performed actions in sets of 3, and believed that if humanity could grasp the significance of these 3 digits, it would unlock a new understanding of energy and reality. Now apply a simple mathematical operation to the solfeggio frequencies. Take the first tone, 396 Hz, and add its individual digits together. 3 plus 9 plus 6 equals 18. Add those digits. 1 plus 8 equals 9. Take 417 Hz. 4 plus 1 plus 7 equals 12. 1 plus 2 equals 3. Take 528. 5 plus 2 plus 8 equals 15. 1 plus 5 equals 6. Take 639. 6 plus 3 plus 9 equals 18. 9. Take 741. 7 plus 4 plus 1 equals 12. 3. Take 852. 8 plus 5 plus 2 equals 15. 6. Every single solfeggio frequency, without exception, reduces through this process to a 3, a 6, or a 9. This process, called digital root reduction, or in the ancient tradition, Pythagorean reduction, is not a trick of selective number choosing. The 6 solfeggio frequencies were not picked because they happen to produce this pattern. The pattern is what defines them. It is the mathematical skeleton of the entire system, the numerical principle from which the specific frequencies were derived. Someone, at some point in the ancient world, built a musical scale on a foundation of sacred mathematics. And the scale they built, it turns out, has properties that modern science is only now beginning to fully understand. In the year 590 CE, a man who would later be known as Gregory the Great became the Bishop of Rome. He was not a musician, though he understood music's power. He was an administrator, one of the most gifted institutional organizers in the history of the Church. And in the decades of his papacy, he undertook a systematic effort to collect, standardize, and codify the various traditions of sacred chanting that had evolved across different regions and monastic communities of the Christian world. The result of this effort was what we now call Gregorian chant, a body of sacred music so influential that its basic melodic shapes and modal structures still define the sound of sacred music in many traditions around the world. Today, what Gregory was preserving was not a modern invention. The chanting traditions he collected drew from roots that extended backward through the early Christian communities of Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem communities that had themselves absorbed musical traditions from the Jewish temple tradition, from Greek sacred music, and from the vastly older tradition of Egyptian temple chant. The melodies, the modal systems, and the specific tonal relationships encoded in the earliest layers of Gregorian chant were the accumulated inheritance of a musical wisdom tradition that predated the Church by thousands of years. The physical spaces in which this chant was designed to be heard were themselves part of the system. Medieval cathedral architecture was not acoustically neutral. The specific proportions of a Romanesque nave, the curvature of an apsidal ceiling, the composition and thickness of stone walls, the placement of alcoves and side chapels, all of these elements combined to create acoustic environments that were, in a precise technical sense, tuned. Certain frequencies were amplified, others were absorbed. The resonant profile of a medieval stone church was as carefully considered as its visual design. Gregorian chant was performed exclusively by trained male voices, singing in unison, without instrumental accompaniment. This was not merely a matter of ecclesiastical tradition or theological preference. Unison singing multiple voices, producing the same tone simultaneously, maximizes the mathematical purity of the frequency. When instruments are added, when harmony is introduced, when rhythmic complexity is layered over a simple melodic line, the acoustic environment of the space becomes richer and more complex. But the specific biological impact of any individual frequency is diluted. The monks who sang these chants were not performing for an audience. They were operating a frequency delivery system of extraordinary precision, one that had been refined over centuries of careful observation of its effects on the human body and the human mind. And at the center of that system were 6 tones, each precisely defined, each with a specific syllabic name, each associated in the ancient tradition with a specific range of biological and spiritual effects. 6 tones that, together, formed what the Benedictine monk Guido of Arezzo would later codify as the hexachord, the musical scale, whose mathematical structure, as the next chapter will reveal, reaches far deeper into the architecture of life itself than anyone has been officially told. The lowest of the 6 solfeggio tones sits at 396 Hz, a frequency that, in the original tradition of sacred chanting, carried the Latin designation times ut quant laxis, meaning, in rough translation, so that the servants may freely resonate. The ancient description of this tone's effect was specific. It was the frequency of liberation, not liberation in a political sense, but in a biological one, the loosening of the physiological grip that guilt, grief, and fear maintain on the nervous system when they are held without resolution. Modern psychoacoustics, the scientific study of how sound affects emotional and neurological processing, offers a precise parallel. Sound frequencies in the range of 396 Hz have been measured to correlate with shifts from beta brainwave activity, which is associated with analytical thinking, stress responses, and the chronic low-level anxiety of modern life, toward alpha and theta states, which are associated with calm alertness, creative receptivity, and the kind of meditative openness in which emotional processing can occur without the defensive filters that beta consciousness maintains. In simpler terms, this frequency appears to move the brain from the state in which it defends itself against feeling into the state in which it can safely feel. The monks of the Gregorian tradition used this tone specifically in penitential liturgy, the chants performed during periods of communal grief or spiritual reckoning. They were not, within their own theological framework, thinking about brainwave states or psychoacoustic mechanisms. They were following a tradition whose practical effects had been observed and refined over centuries of careful use. The science came later. The knowledge of what the frequency did came first. What is quietly significant, and what will become more significant as this story unfolds, is that 396 Hz was among the first of the solfeggio tones to be altered when the original scale was replaced by the equal temperament system. Of all the frequencies that could have been modified first, the one associated with emotional liberation was changed earliest. Whether that sequence reflects a deliberate intention or a coincidence of musical mathematics is a question that the historical record does not answer directly, but it is a question worth holding. The second tone in the solfeggio system, 417 Hz, was described in the ancient tradition as the frequency of time's facilitated change. More specifically, it was associated with the clearing of what the tradition called crystallized energy patterns of thought, emotion, and physical tension that had become fixed in the body through unresolved trauma or habitual stress. In the language of the ancient system, this was the tone that broke what could not otherwise be broken, that loosened what had become rigid, and created the internal space for transformation to begin. The parallel in modern research involves water. Dr. Masaru Emoto's controversial but widely documented studies demonstrated that water exposed to specific frequencies, words, and intentions formed dramatically different crystalline structures when frozen and photographed with frequencies in the range of 417 Hz, producing formations of unusual geometric elegance compared to the disordered patterns produced by random or discordant sound. Since the human body consists of approximately 70% water, the implication that the acoustic environment surrounding a person is physically restructuring the medium in which their biology operates is, to put it mildly, significant. Then there is 528 Hz. This is the tone that researchers keep returning to, the frequency that accumulates unusual findings with unusual consistency. It has been called the love frequency, the miracle tone, the frequency of transformation and DNA repair names that sound like marketing language until you look at the studies behind them. A 2017 paper in the Journal of Addiction Research and Therapy documented a 65% reduction in total anxiety in participants exposed to 528 Hz music compared to control groups. A study by Dr. Lee Lorenzen found that water structured at 528 Hz displayed molecular properties consistent with the clustered water found inside the DNA double helix. Research conducted at the Biochemistry Department of Settings University found that 528 Hz sound waves increased the UV light absorption of DNA by approximately 7.8%. Each of these findings, taken alone, raises questions. Taken together, they begin to form an answer to the question of why someone might have wanted this specific frequency removed from the public musical vocabulary. As the solfeggio scale ascends, its associations move outward from the individual body toward the space between bodies, and then upward, toward the dimensions of mind and consciousness that conventional science is only beginning to learn how to measure. The fourth tone, at 639 Hz, was described in the original tradition as the frequency of connection, specifically of the harmonious alignment between individuals, families, and communities. It was the tone used in chants associated with reconciliation, with the repair of broken relationships, with the re-establishment of social bonds that grief or conflict had frayed. The HeartMath Institute in California has documented a phenomenon they call social coherence, the measurable synchronization of heart rate variability patterns across groups of people who enter states of shared emotional alignment. When groups meditate together, pray together, or engage in synchronized musical activity, the electrical patterns of their hearts begin to oscillate in rhythmic harmony with each other, creating what researchers describe as a field of shared biological resonance. Communal chanting at 639 Hz, the ancient tradition appears to have understood intuitively, was a technology for creating exactly this kind of biological synchrony between the members of a community. 741 Hz was the tone of what the tradition called times awakening, intuition times, the clearing of mental interference, and the enhancement of perceptual clarity. Modern research on frequencies in this range has found associations with immune system activation and the stimulation of lymphatic drainage, connecting the ancient concept of mental clarity with the biological process of physical detoxification in a way that initially seems paradoxical and, on reflection, makes a kind of deep sense. 852 Hz, the highest of the original 6 tones, was associated in the ancient system with what was called times, returning to spiritual order, times the alignment of individual consciousness with its highest functional state. In modern neuroscience, this corresponds to the gamma brainwave range, which is associated with peak cognitive performance, heightened pattern recognition, and the states of expanded awareness that contemplative traditions across the world have described as the threshold of mystical experience. The ancient tradition and the neuroscience laboratory, arriving from entirely different directions, found the same door. Standing back from the individual frequencies and looking at the 6 tones as a unified system, what emerges is not a collection of interesting coincidences, but a coherent, logically structured protocol, a complete map of human, biological, and spiritual function, from its most fundamental physical processes to its highest cognitive and consciousness dimensions. The progression from 396 Hz through 852 Hz is not random. It follows a specific ascending logic, moving from emotional liberation through cellular transformation, through social alignment, through mental clarity, to spiritual integration. Each tone builds on the one before it, prepares the ground for the one that follows, and together they describe a complete cycle of healing and elevation that the ancient tradition used not as an occasional therapy, but as a daily, communal practice. The physical architecture of the medieval cathedral, the building in which this music was designed to be heard, mirrors this progression in spatial terms. The acoustic profile of a Romanesque cathedral is not uniform throughout the space. The resonant frequencies near the entrance, in the reverberant stone spaces of the nave, emphasize the lower frequency ranges. As a worshipper moves eastward toward the altar, the acoustic environment shifts, the frequency profile brightens, the resonant characteristics change. The sound becomes simultaneously more complex and more focused. The physical journey through the building was, in acoustic terms, a guided journey through the frequency spectrum of the Solfeggio scale. The most remarkable structural feature of the six-tone system, however, is invisible to the ear. When researchers plot the six Solfeggio frequencies against each other on a mathematical graph, mapping their proportional relationships as points in a geometric space, the pattern that emerges is a spiral. Not approximately spiral-like, not metaphorically spiral in some loose interpretive sense. A precise mathematical spiral whose proportional ratios correspond to the Fibonacci sequence, the same sequence of numbers that governs the spiral of a nautilus shell, the arrangement of seeds in a sunflower, the branching of blood vessels, and the double helix of DNA. The ancient scale and the geometry of life are built from the same mathematical blueprint. The people who designed the Solfeggio system knew this. They encoded it in six tones and called it sacred music. Most accounts of the Solfeggio system stop at six. 6 tones, 6 syllables, 6 frequencies, arranged in a Fibonacci spiral. It is a complete and satisfying system, and for centuries, the rediscovery of these 6 tones was considered the complete recovery of what had been lost. But the mathematics does not stop at 6. And if you follow the numerical logic of the Solfeggio system to its full conclusion, you find not 6 tones, but 9. 3 additional frequencies that complete the pattern, close the spiral, and describe a range of biological effects that extend far beyond what the original 6 tones can reach. The 3 additional frequencies are 174 Hz, 285 Hz, and 963 Hz. Together with the original 6, they form a 9-frequency system that divides into 3 groups of 3. Each group summing through the process of digital root reduction to 3, 6, and 9 respectively. The mathematical architecture of the complete system is the 3-6-9 pattern that Tesla described as the key to the universe, expressed in 9 sound frequencies spanning the full range of human, biological, and consciousness experience. 174 Hz, the lowest of the hidden 3, has been associated in modern sound therapy research with the reduction of physical pain, not through any anesthetic mechanism, but through its measurable effect on the central nervous system's processing of pain signals. 285 Hz has been associated with cellular regeneration and the stimulation of tissue repair. And 963 Hz, the highest of all 9 tones, sometimes called the frequency of the gods in various alternative traditions, has been associated with the activation of the pineal gland, the small but neurologically extraordinary structure at the center of the brain that secretes melatonin and is involved in the regulation of sleep, circadian rhythm, and certain profound altered states of consciousness. The discovery of the complete 9-tone system means that the Solfeggio tradition was not 6/7 intact, as researchers initially believed. It was 2/3 visible and 1/3 hidden, with the hidden third corresponding to the most fundamental physical healing properties at one end and the highest states of consciousness available to the human brain at the most other. The completeness of what was concealed is itself a form of evidence. Before human beings had words for the things they understood, they had numbers. Not numbers in the abstract algebraic sense of modern mathematics, but numbers as living principles, each one carrying specific properties, specific correspondences, specific creative powers that made it not merely a tool for counting, but a key for understanding the structure of the world. This is not a primitive or superstitious idea. It is, in various sophisticated forms, the foundational premise of every major intellectual tradition in the ancient world, and it is, in a form that the ancients would have found entirely recognizable, the foundation of modern theoretical physics, in which the universe is described not as a collection of objects, but as a set of mathematical relationships expressed in the behavior of matter and energy. In the Pythagorean tradition, number was not invented by human beings. Number was discovered uncovered from its hiding place in the structure of the universe, like an archaeologist uncovering an artifact. The mathematical ratios governing musical harmony were not conventions agreed upon by musicians. They were properties of reality that existed before music, before musicians, before humanity, waiting in the vibrating strings and resonating air columns of the natural world, to be recognized by any mind attentive enough to perceive them. The Hebrew Kabbalistic tradition developed a parallel system, gematria, in which every letter of the Hebrew alphabet was assigned a numerical value, so that every word carried a hidden numerical identity that connected it to every other word sharing its numerical root. The sacred texts written in this system were understood to operate on two levels simultaneously: the surface level of their literal meaning and the deeper level of their mathematical structure, in which hidden correspondences between apparently unrelated concepts were encoded in the numerical architecture of the language. The Vedic mathematical tradition, which gave us zero, the decimal system, and algebraic concepts centuries before they appeared in the Western world, was equally explicit about the sacred dimension of number. The Sanskrit term for mathematics times Ganita times carries within it the root times Gana, meaning a group or collection of divine intelligences. Mathematics, in this tradition, was not a human tool for solving problems. It was a divine language for understanding creation. And then there is the pattern that connects all of these traditions to the Solfeggio frequencies, the 3-6-9 structure that underlies the entire 9-tone system. Apply digital root reduction to every frequency in the complete Solfeggio scale. Apply it to the dimensions of the Great Pyramid of Giza. Apply it to the orbital periods of the planets in their relationship to each other. Apply it to the frequency ratios of the natural harmonic series. Apply it to the base measurements of major sacred sites around the world: Stonehenge, the Hypogeum of Malta, the Temple of Karnak, the Chartres Cathedral Labyrinth. The same pattern keeps appearing, not because the ancient builders were imposing a human preference on an indifferent universe, but because the universe itself is organized around this structure. And the Solfeggio system is, among other things, a musical map of that organization, 6 or 9 tones that correspond to the deepest numerical architecture of physical reality. In the 1960s, a Swiss physician and natural scientist named Hans Jenny began publishing a series of extraordinary photographs. In his laboratory, he had covered metal plates with fine sand, powder, and liquid, attached speakers to the plates, and played pure tones through them at specific frequencies. What the photographs showed, and what researchers who have replicated his work continue to show, is that sound does not merely move through the material world, it organizes it. At each specific frequency, the material on Jenny's plates formed a distinct and precise geometric pattern. The patterns were not random and not approximate. They were exact perfect mandalas, crystalline lattices, flowing spirals and grids, forms of such geometric regularity that they looked as though they had been drawn by a compass and ruler rather than produced by invisible vibrating air. When the frequency changed, the pattern changed. When the frequency was removed, the material collapsed back into randomness. The order was entirely a function of the sound. Jenny called this field of study cymatics, from the Greek word for wave, and the 2 volumes he published, documenting his findings, remain among the most visually stunning scientific records of the 20th century. Before Jenny, an 18th century German physicist named Ernst Chladni had documented the same phenomenon using a violin bow drawn along the edge of a metal plate, producing what are now called Chladni figures, which appear in physics textbooks as demonstrations of resonance and standing wave patterns. But Jenny went further, documenting not just the existence of sound-produced geometric patterns, but their specific relationship to frequency, the precise correspondence between a given tone and a given form. The implications for the Solfeggio frequencies are direct and visually compelling. When researchers have performed cymatic experiments, specifically using the 6 Solfeggio tones, playing each frequency through water or fine powder, and photographing the resulting patterns, what appears is not generic geometric regularity, but something far more specific. The pattern produced by 528 Hz in water is a 6-pointed geometric form whose proportions correspond to the flower of life, one of the most widespread symbols in ancient sacred art, appearing in Egyptian temples at Abydos, dated to approximately 10,500 BCE, in Leonardo da Vinci's notebooks, in Islamic architectural ornamentation, and in Vedic temple carvings across India. The pattern produced by 396 Hz resembles the Sri Yantra, a sacred geometric form from the Vedic tradition, composed of 9 interlocking triangles that is considered in that tradition to be the geometric representation of the universe's creative process. The pattern produced by 852 Hz corresponds to forms found in the dome mosaics of Byzantine churches, forms that the architects of those spaces had no cymatic laboratory in which to design, but which they apparently knew, by a route that modern scholarship cannot entirely trace, corresponded to a specific sacred frequency. Sound produces specific shapes. The Solfeggio frequencies produce shapes that ancient temple builders, working in multiple cultures across thousands of years, chose to carve in stone. The connection is not coincidental, it is not metaphorical, it is geometric. If sound shapes matter, if specific frequencies produce specific, reproducible geometric forms in physical materials, then the possibility arises that the people who built the great sacred structures of the ancient and medieval world were not merely creating beautiful spaces for worship. They were engineering acoustic environments with a precision and intentionality that modern architecture is only beginning to approach. And the evidence for this, accumulated over the past 3 decades by researchers in the field of archaeoacoustics, is now substantial enough to demand serious engagement. Rupert Till, a professor of music at the University of Huddersfield, and his colleague Bruno Fazenda, spent years creating a detailed acoustic computer model of Stonehenge, not as it exists today, in its partially collapsed state, but as the complete original structure would have appeared, with all of its lintels in place and all of its stones standing. Their model showed that the original Stonehenge would have produced specific resonant frequencies within the stone circle that dramatically enhanced the experience of communal singing and percussive sound at specific pitches that align with the lower solfeggio tones. Stonehenge, their research concluded, was not merely a calendar or a ceremonial meeting place. It was a sound chamber, designed to amplify the acoustic technologies of its builders. The Hypogeum of Halsaflieni in Malta presents an even more striking case. This extraordinary underground complex, carved entirely from limestone, beginning around 3600 BCE, contains a chamber known as the Oracle Room, whose acoustic properties have been the subject of significant scientific interest. Researchers have measured the resonant frequency of this chamber at approximately 110 Hz, a frequency that, when sounds are produced within it, creates a profound enhancement of the human voice and has been documented to produce measurable shifts in brain activity toward theta and delta states in anyone who spends time listening within it. The room was not accidentally resonant. The angle of its ceiling, the curvature of its walls, the specific depth at which it was carved, all of these features worked together to produce a specific acoustic effect that its builders understood and intended. And then there is Chartres Cathedral, the greatest of the Gothic churches of medieval France, whose construction began in 1194, and whose acoustic environment has been studied more systematically than almost any other sacred space in Europe. Within the famous labyrinth pattern set into the stone floor of the nave, a path that medieval pilgrims walked on their knees as a devotional practice, researchers have identified a specific acoustic node, a point at which multiple frequency waves converge and amplify. The resonant frequency at this node, measurable with standard acoustic equipment, is 528 Hz. The center of the labyrinth of Chartres Cathedral vibrates at the DNA repair frequency. Whether the cathedral builders knew this in the terms that modern science uses, or knew it in different terms entirely, the physical fact is unchanged. They built it that way. Somewhere in the history of Western music, a decision was made. It was not announced dramatically, was not debated in public forums, and did not appear in the cultural record as the significant event that it was. The decision was a numerical one, a choice between 2 possible reference pitches for the tuning of all Western musical instruments. The 2 candidates were A equals 432 Hz and A equals 440 Hz. The difference between them, measured in vibrations per second, is 8. Measured in terms of their impact on the biological and mathematical relationship between Western music and the natural frequency architecture of the universe, the difference is considerably larger. When the entire Western musical scale is tuned so that the note A vibrates at 432 Hz, something mathematically elegant happens. The other notes in the scale fall into frequency relationships with each other that correspond with remarkable precision to the ratios of the natural harmonic series, the series of overtones that a vibrating string or air column naturally produces. At 432 Hz tuning, the note C vibrates at 256 Hz, which is a power of 2 to the 8th power. The mathematical relationships between all the notes are clean, whole number ratios, corresponding to the Pythagorean system of natural tuning. And when you overlay the solfeggio frequencies on a scale tuned to 432 Hz, they align. The mathematical relationships are harmonious. The ancient system and the tuning standard fit together. At 440 Hz, they do not. The same overlay produces fractional, non-whole number relationships between the tuning standard and the solfeggio frequencies. The mathematical harmony is broken not catastrophically, not audibly in any obvious sense, but structurally. The connection is severed. The ancient scale and the modern tuning standard exist in the same acoustic space, but no longer communicate with each other in the language of whole number mathematical harmony. Prior to the 20th century, tuning standards varied across Europe, but the most widely used concert pitch was closer to 432 Hz. Verdi, the great Italian opera composer, campaigned vigorously for A equals 432 Hz as the standard pitch, arguing on both acoustic and physiological grounds that it produced more resonant, more natural, and less vocally straining results than the higher pitches used by some opera houses of his era. Other major figures in the history of classical music, including Mozart, whose surviving instruments are tuned to approximately 422 Hz, and Bach, whose organ music was written for instruments tuned between 415 and 430 Hz, worked comfortably within the 432 Hz range. The shift to 440 Hz as a global standard occurred at a conference in London in 1939. Several major musical institutions opposed the change, citing exactly the acoustic and physiological arguments that Verdi had articulated decades earlier. They were overruled. And since 1939, every musical instrument manufactured for professional use in the Western world has been tuned to a reference pitch that stands 8 cycles per second away from the natural harmonic alignment of the universe and of the ancient healing scale that was built within it. To understand how something as fundamental as a musical scale can be changed, you have to understand who controlled music in medieval Europe and what that control meant in practice. In the world of the 10th, 11th, and 12th centuries, music was not a commercial enterprise. There were no recording studios, no concert halls, no music publishers, no independent composers making a living from the sale of their compositions. Music, at least the kind of music that reached a significant public audience, that shaped the sonic environment of communities and the liturgical life of populations, was entirely controlled by the Catholic Church. The Church decided what was sung, how it was sung, when it was sung, and in what tonal system it was sung. It decided who was trained to sing, what that training consisted of, and what the correct form of any given chant was. Music was institutional property, and the institution that owned it was the most powerful organization in the Western world. This total institutional control had 2 important consequences for the story of the solfeggio frequencies. The first is that it was the condition under which the ancient frequency system survived at all. The disciplined, standardized practice of monastic chanting, maintained across hundreds of monasteries spread across Europe, preserved the solfeggio system through centuries of political upheaval, plague, famine, and war that destroyed most of the intellectual heritage of the ancient world. Only because the Church maintained the chanting tradition, with such rigorous institutional consistency, did the 6 tones survive long enough to be eventually rediscovered. The second consequence is darker. The same institutional control that preserved the system also made it possible to change the system quietly, efficiently, and with the full weight of the Church's authority behind the change, without any public debate or recorded objection. The Council of Trent, which convened in 25 separate sessions between 1545 and 1563, addressed nearly every aspect of Catholic practice and doctrine that the Protestant Reformation had called into question. Among its many reforms was a comprehensive restructuring of sacred music. The Council's musical guidelines, largely implemented through the work of the Roman composer Giovanni Pierluigi da Palestrina, moved church music away from the purely modal, single-voice chanting tradition of the Gregorian system toward polyphony, the intricate interweaving of multiple simultaneous vocal lines that defines the Renaissance choral tradition. The music that emerged from this reform was, by any aesthetic standard, extraordinarily beautiful. Palestrina's masses and motets are among the most exquisite pieces of choral music ever written, and their influence on the subsequent development of Western music is immeasurable. But the shift they represented had a specific acoustic consequence that deserves to be stated plainly. In polyphonic music, multiple notes are sounding simultaneously, each one occupying a portion of the acoustic space. The rich harmonic texture that results is deeply pleasing to the ear, but it makes it impossible to experience any individual frequency in its pure, isolated form. The resonant impact of a single precise tone, the biological effect of 396 Hz or 528 Hz as a pure, uninterrupted vibration in a resonant stone chamber requires that the tone be present alone, or nearly alone, in the acoustic environment. Add harmony, and the tone becomes one voice in a crowd. Its specific biological frequency still exists, technically, but its power is diffused beyond any threshold of physiological impact. The Council of Trent did not abolish the solfeggio frequencies. It surrounded them with so much acoustic complexity that they could no longer be heard. If the Council of Trent obscured the solfeggio frequencies by covering them with harmonic complexity, the next assault on the ancient system was more mathematically precise and more mathematically permanent. It came in the latter half of the 17th century, from a small German town called Halberstadt, in the form of a church organist and music theorist whose name is almost entirely unknown outside specialist musicology circles. His name was Andreas Werkmeister, and the tuning system he developed, called equal temperament, changed the mathematical structure of all Western music so fundamentally that its effects are still with us today, embedded in every piano, every guitar, every digital synthesizer, every auto-tune algorithm in every recording studio on Earth. The practical problem that equal temperament was designed to solve was a real one. In natural tuning systems, the Pythagorean system, and its various descendants, the mathematical ratios between musical intervals are pure. The fifth, for example, has a ratio of exactly 3:2. The major third has a ratio of exactly 5:4. These ratios produce intervals of perfect consonance, physically beautiful, resonant, and mathematically whole. But they create a significant practical problem for instruments with fixed pitches, particularly the keyboard instruments that were becoming central to European musical life in the 17th century. In a natural tuning system, an instrument can be tuned to play purely and resonantly in one musical key, but if you try to play in a different key, the intervals are slightly but audibly wrong. To play in all keys, you need to retune. For a lutenist or a violinist, this was manageable. For an organist with hundreds of pipes, each at a fixed pitch, it was a serious obstacle. Equal temperament solved this problem by abandoning mathematical purity entirely. In equal temperament, the octave is divided into 12 equal semitones, each one a precise mathematical fraction of the total octave, defined by the 12th root of 2. This produces an instrument that plays equally well in any key, because every key is equally, precisely, and slightly out of tune. The intervals are no longer pure mathematical ratios. The fifth is no longer exactly 3:2. The major third is no longer exactly 5:4. Every interval, except the octave, is a carefully calculated compromise, close enough to pure to be musically usable, but never pure. The consequences of this for the solfeggio system are direct and structural. The 6 solfeggio frequencies, 396, 417, 528, 639, 741, 852 Hz, are defined by pure mathematical ratios. They exist as specific precise frequencies in the natural harmonic series. In an equal temperament system, the notes of the scale do not fall on these frequencies. They fall close to them, close enough that the ear perceives them as the same pitches, but the specific numbers are different. 528 Hz does not exist as a note in the equal temperament scale. It falls in the gap between two notes, belonging fully to neither. The mathematical precision that made these frequencies biologically active has been dissolved into a system of universal compromise. Johann Sebastian Bach embraced equal temperament enthusiastically. The well-tempered clavier was written specifically to demonstrate its practical freedom. The music Bach wrote using the new system is among the greatest ever created. But in choosing the freedom of equal temperament, Western music permanently abandoned the mathematical precision of the ancient healing scale. The beauty that was gained and the medicine that was lost were traded in the same transaction. Mathematical systems and institutional reforms could obscure the solfeggio frequencies and change the tuning standard. But the most direct assault on the ancient tradition, and the hardest to quantify because its full extent can never be known, was physical. It was the destruction of the manuscripts, the chant books, the theoretical treatises, and the musical documents that contained the original notation and the original theoretical framework of the pre-medieval chanting tradition. And this destruction happened not once but repeatedly, across several centuries, through several distinct waves of institutional violence against the accumulated written knowledge of the pre-Reformation world. The dissolution of the English monasteries by Henry VIII between 1536 and 1541 resulted in the dispersal or destruction of an estimated 80% of England's pre-existing library holdings. The monastic libraries of medieval England contained a significant proportion of the surviving musical manuscripts of the Anglo-Saxon and early Norman periods, including chant books, music theory texts, and liturgical documents whose contents have never been fully recovered. John Leland, appointed by Henry as the king's antiquary, with the specific mandate to catalogue the libraries before their dissolution, reported in despair that he could not work fast enough, that books were being sold as wrapping paper, used to clean boots, and burned in bonfires faster than he could record their titles. The musical heritage of 5 centuries of English monastic life was largely gone within a decade. The Spanish Inquisition, over its centuries of activity, targeted heterodox and indigenous texts with particular systematic thoroughness. The burning of the Aztec codices by Bishop Diego de Landa in 1562, a single event that destroyed an estimated 5,000 sacred texts accumulated over centuries of Mesoamerican civilization, is the most notorious of these acts, but it was neither unique nor exceptional within the broader pattern of institutional text destruction that accompanied the expansion of European ecclesiastical authority. Libraries that contained musical theoretical documents associating specific tones with healing and spiritual transformation were, from the perspective of church orthodoxy, potentially dangerously close to the category of natural magic that the Inquisition was specifically tasked with eliminating. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 destroyed or dispersed the contents of the Byzantine Imperial Library, which had preserved significant portions of the intellectual heritage of the ancient Greek world, including, according to several Byzantine scholars, musical theoretical manuscripts that predated Guido of Arezzo's hexachord by centuries. How much of the original Solfeggio theoretical tradition was contained in those manuscripts cannot be known, because the manuscripts themselves no longer exist. What is known, what the historical record does clearly show, is that the sum of these destructions across 3 centuries created a profound and largely irreversible gap in the documentary evidence for the pre-Tridentine musical tradition. The fragments that survived did so in isolated monasteries, too remote or too obscure to attract institutional attention, in the mountains of Umbria, in the deserts of Egypt, in the scriptoriums of Irish monasteries that had never fully accepted Roman authority. These fragments were enough, it would turn out, to allow a rediscovery centuries later. But they were fragments. The full picture of what was lost, and therefore the full understanding of what the Solfeggio system was designed to do, may never be completely reconstructed. History is not only what was destroyed, it is also, quietly and remarkably, what survived. And despite the systematic pressure of 7 centuries of institutional reform, mathematical revision, and physical manuscript destruction, the Solfeggio frequencies did survive, not in any single, intact, undisputed document, but in three distinct forms that together preserve enough of the original system to allow its reconstruction. The first form is textual. A small but significant number of pre-Tridentine chant manuscripts and music theory documents did survive the various purges of the medieval and early modern periods, preserved in the kinds of places that institutional destruction rarely reaches: isolated mountain monasteries, private collections, church libraries in regions that remained outside the direct orbit of Roman authority. Musicologist Peter Jeffrey, in his research into early medieval chant notation, has identified fragments within these surviving manuscripts of notational systems that predate Guido of Arezzo's hexachord and that contain tonal designations inconsistent with the post-Tridentine scale designations that correspond, when translated into frequency terms, to the original Solfeggio tones. The second form of preservation is architectural. The cathedrals, basilicas, and sacred sites built during the period when the Solfeggio tradition was intact still exist in significant numbers, and their acoustic properties, as the previous chapter demonstrated, still express the frequency relationships of the original system in their resonant profiles. The stone does not forget. The geometry of a Romanesque apse, cut from limestone in the 11th century to amplify specific frequency ranges, continues to amplify those frequencies today in any church where the original acoustic dimensions have not been altered by modern renovation. The buildings are, in this sense, living documents, frequency texts written in stone that no institutional decree could burn and no mathematical reform could retune. The third form is oral, and it is perhaps the most remarkable because it represents an unbroken living transmission that has continued for over 1400 years without interruption. The Eastern Orthodox and Coptic Christian chanting traditions, which developed independently of the Western Roman Church and were therefore not subject to the Tridentine reforms, have maintained chanting practices whose tonal systems musicologists have analysed in detail. The Byzantine chant tradition uses a system of tonal modes, the echoe, whose modal structures, when analysed in frequency terms, contain relationships consistent with the Solfeggio hexachord. The Coptic tradition in Egypt, which traces its direct lineage to the Alexandrian Church of the 2nd century CE, is particularly significant. Its tonal system preserves ancient Egyptian musical elements that may represent the oldest continuous, direct transmission of frequency-based sacred music anywhere in the world. And then there is the most unexpected survival of all, the one that would not be found in a monastery library or a stone cathedral, but in the numerical structure of a text that has been read by billions of people in complete ignorance of the frequency code embedded within it. In a specific section of the Book of Numbers, in the chapter and verse designations of a sequence of passages, a 20th century researcher would find the mathematical pattern of the Solfeggio frequencies encoded with a precision that eliminates coincidence as an explanation. That discovery, one of the most extraordinary in the modern history of music, is the subject of the next chapter. In the early 1990s, in a small practice in Idaho, a naturopathic physician named Dr. Joseph Puleo was doing what physicians rarely do, looking for answers in places that medical training does not typically prepare them to look. Puleo was a man of both scientific training and deep spiritual conviction, and he had become increasingly certain that the relationship between sound, number, and biological health was something that the ancient world had understood far more completely than the modern medical establishment acknowledged. He had been studying the Pythagorean tradition of sacred mathematics, the principles of digital root reduction, and the long history of numerical encoding in ancient texts, when something led him to open the Book of Numbers in the Old Testament and begin applying the Pythagorean reduction formula to the chapter and verse numbers of a specific sequence of passages. The methodology was straightforward, if unconventional. Beginning at Numbers chapter 7, verse 12, Puleo identified a skip pattern in the numerical structure of the chapter and verse designations, a pattern that, when the numbers were extracted and subjected to digital root reduction, produced a sequence of 6 reduced values: 3, 6, 9, 6, 3, 6. These values, when used as the basis for a frequency calculation following the mathematical conventions of the Pythagorean harmonic system, produced 6 specific frequencies: 396, 417, 528, 639, 741, and 852 Hz. The Solfeggio hexachord, in its complete form, with every frequency precisely correct, encoded in the chapter and verse structure of a biblical text that had been in continuous public circulation for over 2,000 years, hidden in plain sight in the most widely read book in human history. The probability of this occurring by random coincidence is, by any reasonable mathematical estimate, vanishingly small. Either the pattern was deliberately embedded in the text by someone who understood the solfeggio system and chose to preserve it in a form that would survive regardless of what happened to the musical tradition itself or the name. Numerical coincidence has an explanation that existing mathematics cannot account for. Puleo himself, characteristically humble about the implications of what he had found, presented his findings not as proof of any particular theological or metaphysical claim, but as a mathematical observation of significant interest that deserved serious investigation. He partnered with researcher and author Dr. Leonard Horowitz to document and publish the findings, which appeared in 1,999 inches, a book titled Healing Codes for the Biological Apocalypse. The mathematical appendix of that book, which presents the numerical derivation of the 6 frequencies in full detail, has been independently verified by multiple mathematicians. No one has ever found an error in the mathematics. The pattern is there. The question of what it means is, in the deepest sense, still open. When Puleo and Horowitz published their findings in 1999, the scientific landscape into which their work arrived was more receptive than it might have been a decade earlier. The 1990s had been a productive decade for legitimate research into the biological effects of sound and music. Not fringe research, but peer-reviewed, institution-backed studies that had established beyond reasonable doubt that sound frequencies produced measurable physiological effects in human subjects. The field of music therapy had by this point accumulated sufficient clinical evidence to support professional certification programs and hospital-based practice. The neurological effects of music on the brain were being studied with increasing sophistication using EEG and later fMRI technology. The general principle that sound affected biology was no longer controversial. What remained controversial was the specificity of the claims, the idea that particular frequencies, precisely tuned, produced particular and reproducible biological effects. Into this environment, the Solfeggio research arrived with an unusual combination of mathematical precision and specific testable claims that attracted the attention of researchers willing to investigate with an open but rigorous methodology. The 2017 study, published in the Journal of Addiction Research and Therapy, examining the effects of 528 Hz music on anxiety, is perhaps the most frequently cited. Researchers measured anxiety levels in a group of participants before and after exposure to 528 Hz music using standardized anxiety assessment protocols. The result, a 65% reduction in total anxiety compared to control conditions, was statistically significant, reproducible across multiple test sessions, and could not be explained by the general relaxing effect of music, since participants exposed to standard tuning music of similar character showed significantly smaller reductions. A 2019 Italian study measured autonomic nervous system responses to solfeggio frequency exposure using heart rate variability analysis, finding measurable shifts toward parasympathetic dominance, the physiological state associated with recovery, healing, and rest that were consistent across subjects and reproducible. The study's authors noted that the effect size was comparable to pharmacological interventions for anxiety reduction in some participant subgroups and called for larger-scale clinical trials. The research is not conclusive. The sample sizes are frequently small, the methodologies are sometimes inconsistent across studies, and the mainstream scientific community has been reluctant to commit the significant research funding that would be required for large-scale, rigorously controlled clinical trials. But the directional consistency of the findings across different frequencies within the solfeggio system, different biological outcomes, different research teams, different countries represents a signal that is becoming increasingly difficult to attribute to chance. Something is happening when these frequencies interact with the human body. The research keeps finding it. And the question of why larger institutions are not more urgently investigating it has an answer that becomes clearer the further into this story one travels. The history of ideas contains a recognizable pattern. A researcher finds something that challenges the foundational assumptions of their field. They publish their findings. For a period, the findings are ignored, not refuted, not engaged with, simply not acknowledged by the mainstream institutions that control the flow of academic recognition, funding, and professional opportunity. Then, if the researcher persists, the response escalates from silence to active discreditation, not through scientific rebuttal, which would require engaging with the evidence, but through the application of social and institutional pressure. The researcher's credibility is questioned, their affiliations are scrutinized, their associations with non-mainstream ideas are used to cast doubt on their more rigorous findings by proximity. The goal is not to disprove the research. The goal is to ensure that the research remains outside the circle of what serious people are expected to take seriously. Leonard Horowitz experienced this pattern in a particularly clear and well-documented form. His Solfeggio research, specifically the mathematical derivation of the 6 frequencies from the biblical text, and the compilation of biological research supporting their therapeutic effects, was legitimate scholarship by any reasonable standard. It drew on documented historical sources, applied verifiable mathematical operations, and referenced peer-reviewed scientific studies. It did not make claims beyond what the evidence supported. But Horowitz was also, simultaneously, a public figure who made claims about other subjects, the origins of specific diseases, the motivations of specific institutions that were considerably more speculative and that attracted legitimate criticism. The institutional response conflated these two bodies of work systematically. The mathematical and historical Solfeggio research was treated as tainted by association with Horowitz's more contentious claims, which provided a justification for dismissing it without engagement. Conference invitations were withdrawn. Journal submissions were returned without substantive review. The specific mathematical finding, the Solfeggio frequencies in the Book of Numbers, was never directly refuted because it could not be refuted. It was simply surrounded by a silence so complete that most researchers who might have investigated it never heard of it. Joseph Puleo, whose contribution was more specifically mathematical and less publicly contentious, was even more thoroughly erased from the record. His name rarely appears in discussions of the Solfeggio rediscovery, even in alternative research communities that are familiar with the topic. The man who found the biblical code, who sat in a small office in Idaho and followed a mathematical thread to one of the most remarkable discoveries in the modern history of sacred music, is almost entirely unknown. History, it seems, does not merely fail to record the things that are taken. Sometimes it fails to record the people who find them. Joseph Puleo was not the first person to find something unusual in the relationship between medieval sacred music and specific healing frequencies. He was simply the first to survive the experience, with his findings intact enough to publish them. Before him, in scattered and largely inaccessible corners of the academic record, there are traces of researchers who came close to the same discovery, who found fragments of the same pattern, documented them in papers that were never published, or in books that were never widely distributed, and then, for various reasons, did not pursue the thread to its conclusion. In the early 1970s, an Italian musician and musicologist named Vito Mancusi identified a mathematical inconsistency in the standard historical account of Guido of Arezzo's hexachord, specifically, a discrepancy between the tonal designations in the earliest surviving manuscripts of the Guidonian system and the frequency values assigned to those designations in post-Tridentine music theory. His paper, submitted to a major Italian musicology journal in 1971, argued that the original Solfeggio syllables corresponded to a set of frequencies that had been systematically replaced in the process of standardization. The paper was rejected without detailed explanation. Mancusi presented a version of his findings at a regional musicology conference, where his application was initially accepted and then, 2 weeks before the conference, quietly withdrawn from the program. He never published in the field again. A decade later, in Britain, an acoustic physicist named Howard Levine published a small monograph through a minor academic press, arguing that the acoustic properties of medieval cathedrals were not incidental to their architectural design, but were the primary determinant of their dimensions and proportions, that these buildings had been designed, first and foremost, as frequency chambers, with their visual grandeur being secondary to their acoustic function. His monograph attracted very little attention in 1983. 25 years later, the research of Rupert Till and others in archaeoacoustics confirmed his central thesis in every particular. What these examples represent, and there are others, less well documented, in the margins of the musicological and acoustical literature of the 20th century, is the existence of a genuine intellectual lineage of solfeggio rediscovery, most of it invisible, because most of it was prevented from becoming visible. The path to the truth about the ancient frequencies was walked more than once, by more than one person, before Puleo and Horowitz found a way to bring it to public attention. Somewhere in filing cabinets and private archives, in rejected manuscripts and abandoned research programs, the evidence has been accumulating for decades. The question is not whether it is there. The question is, who has been ensuring that it stays there, and why? The human body is not a machine. It resembles a machine in certain ways. It has moving parts. It processes inputs and produces outputs. It can be described in mechanical terms, with a degree of accuracy that has made mechanical medicine extraordinarily powerful. But the mechanical model is incomplete in ways that matter deeply to health, and one of the most significant ways in which it is incomplete is its treatment of the body as fundamentally silent. In the mechanical model, biological processes are chemical and electrical molecules binding to receptors, ions flowing through channels, nerve impulses traveling down axons. Sound, in this model, is something that enters the body from outside and is processed by specific sensory organs. It is not something the body itself produces, and it is not something that interacts with the body's internal processes in any fundamental way. This model is wrong. Not wrong in all of its applications. The mechanical chemical model of biology has produced antibiotics, surgical techniques, and diagnostic technologies that have saved hundreds of millions of lives, and these achievements are real and extraordinary, but wrong in the specific sense that matters to this story, because the body is not silent. It is, at every level of its organization, producing, transmitting, and responding to acoustic signals, signals that carry information about cellular health, that coordinate biological processes across distances too large for chemical signaling alone, and that interact with externally produced sound frequencies in ways that have measurable and reproducible effects on biological function. Every cell in the human body has a resonant frequency. This is not a metaphor, and it is not a spiritual claim. It is a physical property of any object with mass and elasticity, the frequency at which it naturally oscillates when disturbed. Atomic force microscopy, a technology developed in the 1980s that allows researchers to measure the mechanical properties of individual cells with extraordinary precision, has confirmed that different cell types oscillate at characteristic frequencies. Red blood cells have a different resonant frequency from liver cells. Neurons have a different resonant frequency from bone cells. Cancerous cells have measurably different resonant frequencies from the healthy cells of the same tissue type, a finding that has significant implications for both diagnosis and treatment that the medical mainstream is only beginning to explore. When a cell's resonant frequency is disrupted, when it is forced by its chemical or acoustic environment to oscillate at a frequency different from its natural healthy state, its function is impaired. The proteins it manufactures fold differently. The signals it sends to neighboring cells are distorted. The efficiency of its energy production decreases. These disruptions, accumulated across millions of cells over months and years, are the cellular basis of chronic disease. And the principle of entrainment, the phenomenon by which two oscillating systems in proximity tend to synchronize their frequencies, means that the acoustic environment surrounding a cell is not neutral with respect to its resonant state. The frequencies present in that environment are constantly pulling the cell's oscillation toward them or away from its natural healthy frequency. This is the physical mechanism that the Solfeggio tradition was working with, not through any mystical or supernatural process, but through the straightforward application of acoustic physics to biological systems. When a person sat in a resonant stone chamber and listened to trained voices singing pure tones at precisely calibrated frequencies, the cells of their body were being exposed to a sustained acoustic entrainment environment. The external frequencies, 396, 528, 741 Hz were providing reference oscillations that the body's own cellular frequencies could synchronize with, moving toward or returning to the resonant states associated with healthy function. The experience felt transcendent because it was biological. The body was being tuned, and the people who had designed the system, who had spent centuries observing what it did to the bodies and minds of those who participated, had calibrated it with a precision that their mathematical and observational tools allowed, and that modern acoustic biology is now confirming was more sophisticated than anyone in the intervening centuries suspected. If the Solfeggio system was a healing protocol, then it was a remarkably complete one. The 9 frequencies of the complete system, from 174 Hz at the lower end to 963 Hz at the upper end, map onto the full range of human biological function with a comprehensiveness that is difficult to attribute to accident. Moving through the scale from lowest to highest is like moving through a biological hierarchy, from the most fundamental physical processes at the bottom to the most complex regulatory systems at the top. 174 Hz sits at the foundation. Research in the field of low-frequency sound therapy has consistently found that frequencies in this range interact with the central nervous system's processing of pain signals in ways that reduce the subjective experience of chronic pain. The mechanism is not fully understood, but the findings are consistent across multiple studies and multiple pain conditions. The ancient tradition's association of this frequency with physical grounding and the relief of bodily suffering is not merely poetic. It maps onto a measurable biological response that modern pain medicine is beginning to take seriously. 285 Hz occupies the next position in the biological hierarchy, associated in the Solfeggio tradition with cellular regeneration and tissue repair. In vitro cellular research studies conducted on isolated cells in laboratory conditions has found that frequencies in the range of 285 Hz affect cell membrane permeability and the rate of cellular division in ways that suggest enhanced regenerative capacity. The cells, in the presence of this frequency, appear more metabolically active in the specific ways associated with repair and growth. 396 Hz, as discussed in Chapter 3, addresses the limbic system and the emotional processing functions associated with fear, guilt, and grief. 417 Hz works on cellular memory and the stored patterns of unresolved trauma in the body's connective tissue. 528 Hz acts on DNA structure and repair mechanisms. These 3 tones address the emotional, cellular memory, and genetic levels of biological organization respectively, a logical progression from the psychological surface to the molecular foundation. 639 Hz maps to cardiovascular function and the coherence of the heart's electromagnetic field, the field that the HeartMath Institute has demonstrated can be detected and responded to by the nervous systems of other people. In proximity, 741 Hz corresponds to immune function and lymphatic activity, the body's systems for identifying and eliminating cellular dysfunction. 852 Hz maps to the brain's higher frequency oscillation states and the neural correlates of expanded awareness. And 963 Hz, the highest of the complete 9 tones, maps to the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the master regulatory system that coordinates the entire endocrine network. This is the system that determines the body's baseline stress response, that regulates the hormonal environment in which every other biological process occurs, and that is chronically dysregulated in the majority of stress-related chronic conditions that dominate the modern disease burden. The fact that the highest Solfeggio frequency corresponds to the regulation of the body's master stress response system in a tradition that was specifically designed as a technology for relieving suffering and restoring health is either the most elegant coincidence in the history of medicine or the clearest possible indication that the people who designed this system understood, in their own terms, exactly what they were doing and why. The brain is an electrical organ. Its activity at any given moment can be characterized by the dominant frequency of the electrical oscillations produced by the coordinated firing of billions of neurons. oscillations that are measurable at the scalp using electroencephalography, and that correspond with reasonable consistency to specific states of consciousness and cognitive function. When you are engaged in focused analytical thinking, your brain is dominated by beta waves, oscillating between approximately 13 and 40 Hz. When you are calmly alert, relaxed but aware, creative but not anxious, your brain shifts into the alpha range, between 8 and 12 Hz. When you enter deep relaxation, meditation, or the hypnagogic state between waking and sleep, theta waves predominate, in the range of 4 to 7 Hz. In deep, dreamless sleep, delta waves take over, oscillating at the very lowest frequencies of 0.5 to 3 Hz. And in states of peak performance, mystical experience, and heightened awareness, the brain produces gamma waves, rapid oscillations in the range of 40 to 100 Hz that are associated with the integration of information across different brain regions and the subjective experience of expanded or illuminated consciousness. The connection between solfeggio frequencies and these brainwave states is mediated through a phenomenon called binaural beats, one of the most elegantly simple and best documented mechanisms in the neuroscience of sound. When the left ear receives a tone at one frequency and the right ear receives a tone at a slightly different frequency, the brain does not simply hear two tones. It generates a third frequency corresponding to the mathematical difference between the two, and it shifts its dominant brainwave pattern toward this difference frequency. The effect is automatic, involuntary, and physiologically measurable. It is not a matter of suggestion or belief. It is neurological mechanics. In a stone cathedral, performing or listening to Gregorian chant, the acoustic environment naturally generates the conditions for binaural beat entrainment. The primary tone of the chant enters both ears, but the reverberant reflections of that tone from the stone walls arrive at each ear at slightly different times and with slightly different frequency profiles, because the left and right walls are never acoustically identical. The difference between the direct sound and the reflected sound between the left ear and right ear acoustic environments falls within the range that generates binaural beat entrainment. Without any deliberate engineering, or with the deliberate engineering that went into the design of the acoustic spaces, the monks were creating a neurotechnology that guided the brains of everyone present from beta consciousness into alpha, theta, and delta states in sequence, over the course of a chanting session that might last an hour or more. The result that a medieval monk would have described as prayer producing spiritual openness, and that a modern neuroscientist would describe as sustained theta-delta brainwave entrainment, are the same physiological event described in two different languages. And the specific tones used, the solfeggio frequencies, precisely calibrated to their mathematical positions in the natural harmonic series, were not chosen because they sounded beautiful, though they did. They were chosen because centuries of careful observation had established that these specific frequencies, in these specific spaces, produced these specific neurological effects in the people who experienced them. The tradition knew what it was doing. The science has simply taken 1,000 years to catch up. Every day, in ways that are technically documented but culturally invisible, the modern acoustic environment is doing something to the human body. Not dramatically, not suddenly, not in ways that produce identifiable symptoms in the short term, but persistently, cumulatively, and in directions that are precisely opposite to the biological effects of the solfeggio tradition. The ancient system was designed to return the body to resonant health. The modern acoustic environment, as a consequence of choices made over the past century at multiple levels of the cultural and technological stack, is systematically pulling it away from that resonance. The most technically specific of these effects involves digital audio compression. When music is converted from its original recorded form into the digital file formats used for streaming and download MP3, AAC, OGG, the formats that carry virtually all of the music that human beings consume today, a mathematical algorithm removes significant portions of the original audio information. The algorithm is designed to remove the frequency content that its designers determined was least perceptible to the average human ear, in order to reduce file size while maintaining perceived audio quality. The specific frequency ranges, most aggressively removed by standard digital compression, are in the mid-frequency band, the range between approximately 300 and 900 Hz. This is not a coincidence in the sense that it was chosen deliberately to suppress healing frequencies. It is a compression mathematics artifact. But the effect is the same regardless of the intention. Standard MP3 compression at 128 kilobits per second, which remains the most common streaming quality for mobile and background listening, removes significant harmonic content from precisely the frequency range in which all 6 original solfeggio tones reside. Beyond compression, there is the question of the frequency profile of the modern acoustic environment as a whole. Urban noise traffic, construction, HVAC systems, the omnipresent hum of electrical infrastructure concentrates in the low frequency ranges below 200 Hz and in the irregular, unpatterned noise spectrum that is acoustically antipathetic to entrainment. The specific acoustic characteristics of urban environments are, from the perspective of the body's resonance systems, disorganizing. They provide no stable frequency reference for cellular entrainment. They create a constant, low-level acoustic interference that the nervous system must continuously process without being able to use it for biological calibration. Commercial music adds another layer. The frequency profiles of the most widely consumed popular music genres, the heavy bass emphasis of hip-hop, electronic dance music, and heavily compressed pop systematically de-emphasize the mid-frequency range where the solfeggio tones reside, while emphasizing the extreme low and high ends of the spectrum. This is not a conspiracy. It is a consequence of the physical characteristics of small speakers, the dominant listening medium for most music consumers, which reproduce bass and treble more dramatically than mid-range frequencies. But the cumulative effect of a lifetime of listening to music shaped for small speaker response through digitally compressed files at 440 Hz. Tuning is an acoustic diet from which the most biologically active frequencies have been almost entirely removed. The monks who designed the solfeggio system understood that the body needed daily, sustained exposure to specific frequencies to maintain its resonant health. The modern world provides the opposite: daily, sustained exposure to acoustic environments that contain almost none of those frequencies and many that actively work against them. The comparison is not comfortable, but it is accurate. The year is 1939. Europe is standing at the edge of the most destructive conflict in human history. In Berlin, Adolf Hitler has been Chancellor of Germany for 6 years. The Nazi war machine is in full preparation for the invasion of Poland, which will begin on September 1st. And in London, 2 months before that invasion, a group of delegates representing the national standards organizations of several countries met at an International Standards Association conference to discuss a question that sounds, on its surface, entirely technical and entirely benign. The question was, at what frequency should the musical note A be standardized for international use? The history that preceded this conference was a genuine tangle of competing national preferences. Throughout the 19th century, tuning standards had varied enormously across Europe. Italian opera houses, pursuing maximum brilliance from their star tenors, had pushed the reference pitch progressively upward from approximately A equals 422 Hz in the early 1800s toward A equals 450 Hz and beyond by mid-century. French musicians, reacting against the vocal strain and instrument damage caused by these elevated pitches, had lobbied for a lower standard, achieving the adoption of A equals 435 Hz in France in 1859. British orchestras used various standards depending on the institution. German and Austrian orchestras used others. The practical chaos of a world without a common tuning standard was real, and the desire for international standardization was entirely legitimate. The debate at the 1939 conference was between two main competing proposals. A equals 432 Hz, supported by a coalition of European musicians, conductors, and music institutions who argued on acoustic, physiological, and historical grounds for a pitch that aligned with the natural harmonic series, and A equals 440 Hz, which had been promoted by the American Standards Association since 1936, and which had significant support from German technical standards bodies. The arguments for 432 Hz were not fringe positions. They were supported by acoustic measurements, by the evidence of historical instrument tuning, and by the consistent reports of professional singers that the lower pitch produced less vocal strain and a more resonant, blending ensemble sound. The arguments for 440 Hz were primarily practical. It had already been adopted by the American recording industry and by the BBC as a broadcast standard, meaning that a significant amount of infrastructure had already been built around it. The conference voted for 440 Hz. The 432 Hz advocates were outvoted, and the decision was made 2 months before the German army crossed the Polish border in the same European political climate that was producing the defining catastrophe of the 20th century, promoted most strongly by the technical standards bodies of the country that was about to plunge the world into war. The historical juxtaposition does not constitute proof of anything, but it is a detail that, once noticed, does not easily leave the mind. After the 1939 conference, the process of cementing 440 Hz into the infrastructure of global music was not dramatic. It did not involve any further public deliberation or policy announcement. It happened through the quiet, cumulative logic of technological standardization, the way all standards become permanent, not through mandate, but through the progressive embedding of the standard into the tools and systems that practitioners rely on for their daily work. Instrument manufacturers calibrated their products to 440 Hz. Tuning forks, electronic tuners, and reference oscillators were manufactured to the new standard and replaced their predecessors on music store shelves and in orchestra pits around the world. Recording studios built their acoustic reference systems around 440 Hz. Broadcast transmission equipment was calibrated to it. When the first multi-track tape recording systems were introduced in the 1950s, their pitch reference systems were set to 440 Hz as a matter of engineering default. When the digital audio workstation replaced the tape machine in the 1980s and 1990s, the software that ran these systems was coded with 440 Hz as the immovable default tuning reference. The pitch correction tools that became standard in commercial music production in the late 1990s, the Antares Auto-Tune and its descendants, are specifically designed to correct recorded pitch toward the nearest note in the equal temperament scale tuned to 440 Hz. A performance recorded at 432 Hz and processed through standard pitch correction software will be automatically corrected away from its intended tuning. The system is not locked by law. No legislation prohibits recording at 432 Hz. No international treaty mandates the continued use of the 1939 standard. A musician today can, in principle, choose to record at any tuning they prefer. But the practical barriers are formidable in ways that anyone who has worked professionally in music will immediately recognize. Every collaborating musician must retune their instruments from factory settings. Every software tool must be manually overridden. Every reference track, every session musician, every mastering engineer working in the standard professional environment will be operating at 440 Hz by default, creating compatibility issues that require additional work to resolve at every stage of the production process. The lock is not in the law, it is in the infrastructure. And infrastructure, as anyone who has tried to change a deeply embedded technical standard knows, is substantially more resistant to change than law. You can repeal a law. You cannot repeal the fact that several 100 million musical instruments have been manufactured to a specific calibration, that decades of recorded music exist as a reference standard, that the hearing of professional musicians has been trained against 440 Hz as the definition of correct intonation from their first lessons. The standard has become, through the simple accumulation of industrial history, effectively irreversible by any individual or small-scale effort. Changing it would require a coordinated effort by the major music institutions of the world. The same institutions that have shown no inclination to revisit the 1939 decision, or to acknowledge that it was ever controversial. Not everyone accepted the locked standard without question. Throughout the decades following the 1939 standardization, a persistent and gradually growing community of musicians, composers, researchers, and sound healers maintained their practice in natural tuning systems, not always in direct opposition to the 440 Hz standard, but in conscious awareness that the standard was a choice rather than a law of nature, and that other choices were possible and potentially preferable. Maria Renold, an Austrian musician and researcher working in the anthroposophical tradition of Rudolf Steiner, spent decades investigating the physiological and psychological differences between music performed at 440 Hz and music performed at 432 Hz, publishing her findings in 1,992 inches. A book titled Intervals, Scales, Tones, and the Concert Pitch C equals 128 Hz. Renold conducted informal but systematic listening tests with hundreds of subjects over many years, presenting identical musical passages at different tuning standards and collecting qualitative reports of the listening experience. The consistent finding was that 432 Hz tuning was described by the vast majority of listeners as warmer, more resonant, and more emotionally satisfying, while 440 Hz was more frequently described as slightly harsh, bright, or tension-producing. Renold's work was largely ignored by mainstream musicology, but became foundational reading within the 432 Hz revival community. In the contemporary music world, the 432 Hz movement has grown from a fringe curiosity into a significant cultural phenomenon. On YouTube alone, channels dedicated to 432 Hz tuned music have accumulated hundreds of millions of plays. On Spotify and Apple Music, Solfeggio frequency meditation music is among the fastest growing categories in the wellness content segment. Artists working in ambient, new age, and world music genres increasingly release versions of their work at 432 Hz tuning, citing both the sonic qualities and the biological research as motivating factors. The movement is not organized, not centrally coordinated, not affiliated with any institution or authority. It is a grassroots re-evaluation of a standard that was imposed without adequate debate and maintained without adequate justification, carried forward by the simple, democratic mechanism of individual listeners finding that one tuning sounds better, feels better, and leaves them feeling different than the other. The commercial success of solfeggio-tuned content on streaming platforms is particularly telling. These platforms measure engagement with extraordinary precision, not just play counts, but completion rates, repeat plays, skip rates, and the listening duration metrics that determine how the algorithm promotes content. Solfeggio frequency content, on every measurable engagement metric, significantly outperforms comparable content in standard tuning within the meditation and sleep music categories. The algorithm does not care about music, theory, or alternative science. It cares about what keeps people listening, and hundreds of millions of people encountering these frequencies for the first time are listening longer, returning more often, and sharing the content more widely than they do for the standard tuned equivalent. The body knows what the mind has not yet been told. It recognizes something familiar in these sounds. It leans toward them, the way a plant leans toward light. The same physical property that gives the solfeggio frequencies their healing potential. The capacity of specific sound frequencies to directly alter biological and neurological function without the subject's intellectual engagement or volitional consent also makes sound a potential instrument of harm. And the governments and military agencies of the 20th century, it is now a matter of confirmed historical record rather than conspiracy theory, were fully aware of this potential and invested significantly in its development. The CIA's MKULTALTALTALTAL, which operated from 1953 to 1973 and was exposed in the Church Committee Congressional Investigations of 1975, is the most extensively documented program of this type. The program's 150 sub-projects covered a remarkable range of research into methods of altering human psychology and behavior, drugs, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, psychological manipulation, and, specifically, sound. Sub-Project 119, documented in the declassified files available through the National Security Archive, investigated what the project documents describe as techniques for analyzing and manipulating acoustic frequency patterns for effects on human behavior and physiology. The specific findings of Sub-Project 119 remain classified, but the existence of the research is confirmed. the general direction of its inquiry is documented, and the conclusion that specific sound frequencies can be used to alter psychological states and behavioral responses is exactly what both the ancient Solfeggio tradition and the modern biological research have independently established. The military applications of acoustic frequency technology did not end with MKULTR. Long-range acoustic devices, known as LRADs, are deployed by military and law enforcement agencies around the world as non-lethal crowd control weapons, using high-intensity directional sound to cause pain, disorientation, and temporary incapacitation at distances of hundreds of meters. The physiological mechanism, acoustic entrainment of the vestibular and nervous systems is precisely the same mechanism that underlies the therapeutic applications of the Solfeggio tradition, applied in the opposite direction. Infrasonic frequencies, sounds below the threshold of human hearing, in the range of 7 to 19 Hz, have been investigated extensively by military researchers for their documented ability to produce effects ranging from unease and anxiety to nausea, visual disturbances, and profound psychological disorientation in exposed individuals. What this history of weaponized sound research reveals is not merely that sound can be used as a weapon that is a relatively straightforward acoustic fact. What it reveals is that the institutions that standardized Western musical tuning in 1939, that restructured the delivery of sacred music in the 16th century, and that have consistently resisted the investigation of solfeggio, frequency therapy in the 21st century, are the same class of institutions that have simultaneously invested in the weaponized applications of acoustic frequency technology. They understand, with great sophistication, what sound does to the human body. The question of why they have consistently prevented that understanding from reaching the public domain is one that this story does not answer definitively, but it is a question that the evidence demands be asked. Something is shifting. Not quickly, not dramatically, not with the kind of institutional announcement that would suggest a genuine reckoning with what was lost and who was responsible for losing it, but shifting nonetheless, in the way that true changes often begin at the margins, in the practices of individual clinicians who follow their observations rather than their orthodoxies, in the research programs of institutions that are large enough to be credible and small enough to be adventurous. Music therapy is now a recognized clinical profession. It is practiced in hospitals, oncology wards, psychiatric units, neonatal intensive care units, and palliative care settings across the world. Professional music therapists hold graduate degrees from accredited programs at over 70 universities globally, and their practice is supported by a substantial and growing body of peer-reviewed clinical research, demonstrating measurable effects on pain, anxiety, cognitive function, and quality of life across a wide range of patient populations. This is not alternative medicine. It is published in mainstream medical journals and practiced in mainstream medical institutions. The principle that sound affects biology, that music is not merely pleasant but physiologically active, has crossed the threshold from fringe claim to clinical fact. Within this mainstream acceptance of music's biological power, a more specific and more technically sophisticated form of sound therapy is finding its clinical footing. Vibroacoustic therapy delivers specific sound frequencies through speakers embedded in treatment tables, chairs, or mattresses, allowing the physical vibration of the therapeutic frequency to be felt directly in the body's skeletal and muscular structures, as well as heard through the auditory system. Clinical studies of vibroacoustic therapy have documented measurable effects on chronic pain, the tremor symptoms of Parkinson's disease, spasticity in cerebral palsy, and anxiety in chemotherapy patients. The Cleveland Clinic, Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, and several major European hospital systems now offer vibroacoustic therapy sessions as part of their integrative oncology and pain management programs. The frequencies used in vibroacoustic therapy research are not always described in terms of the solfeggio system. The clinical research community tends to work in terms of frequency ranges and physiological outcomes rather than ancient musical traditions. But the frequency ranges that consistently show the strongest clinical effects in vibroacoustic research correspond with remarkable consistency to the lower solfeggio tones. The body does not require the clinical researcher to know the name of the frequency tradition to respond to the frequencies. It simply responds, as it was always designed to respond, with measurable, reproducible, and increasingly undeniable evidence that sound is medicine, and that a very specific kind of sound, tuned to a very specific mathematical pattern, is medicine of a particularly powerful kind. Without a central organization, without a founding manifesto, without a charismatic leader or an institutional sponsor, and almost entirely without mainstream media coverage, something extraordinary has been happening in the global listening population over the past 2 decades. Hundreds of millions of people on every continent, across every cultural background, from every religious tradition, and none have independently begun seeking out music, tuned to the frequencies that Western civilization's official musical tradition discarded 1,000 years ago. They are not doing it because they read a study. Most of them have never heard of the Solfeggio tradition, have no idea who Guido of Arezzo was, and would not immediately recognize the phrase equal temperament if they encountered it. They are doing it because when they hear these frequencies, something in their body responds in a way that standard tuned music does not produce. The streaming data is extraordinary in its consistency. Solfeggio frequency playlists on YouTube regularly accumulate tens of millions of views. The largest dedicated channels have subscriber bases in the multiple millions. On Spotify, tracks specifically tagged as Solfeggio frequency content appear in the top percentile of completion rates within the meditation and sleep music categories, meaning that a significantly higher proportion of listeners play these tracks all the way through and return to them repeatedly, compared to comparable content in standard tuning. The algorithm amplifies this signal impartially. It does not care about the music theory. It measures behavior, and the behavior says, with the unmistakable clarity of aggregate data across hundreds of millions of data points, that people find these frequencies more compelling, more satisfying, and more worth returning to than the standard alternative. The movement extends beyond passive listening. Sound healing practices, the use of Tibetan singing bowls, crystal bowls, tuning forks, gongs, and vocal toning specifically calibrated to solfeggio. Frequencies are practiced in wellness centers, yoga studios, hospices, and community spaces around the world. The market for these practices has grown consistently at double-digit rates for over a decade, and the growth is accelerating rather than plateauing. In architectural practice, the emerging discipline of acoustic ecology is beginning to influence the design of hospitals, schools, and public spaces, incorporating principles of natural resonance that echo, in modern technical language, the same design wisdom that shaped the stone chambers of medieval monasteries. What is happening, when viewed from sufficient altitude, looks less like a trend and more like a correction. A species that was deprived of something essential, something its biological systems require for optimal functioning, is finding its way back to it through the simple mechanism of exposure and recognition. The body knows what it needs. Given the chance to hear these frequencies, it chooses them, every time. While the cultural movement rebuilds the solfeggio tradition from below, through the choices of individual listeners and practitioners, a parallel effort is underway in research laboratories, in acoustic engineering workshops, and in the intersection between ancient musical knowledge and cutting-edge biological science. The scientists who are doing this work are not, for the most part, motivated by spiritual conviction or alternative cultural identity. They are motivated by evidence, by the consistent experimental finding that these frequencies do things to biological systems that require explanation, and that the existing scientific framework does not provide one. Dr. Fabienne Maman, a French musician and acupuncturist who conducted landmark research at the University of Paris in 1988 and subsequently at the University of California, used Kirlian photography to document the changes in the cellular energy field produced by different musical frequencies. His photographs, which show the luminous plasma field surrounding healthy cells, expanding and brightening in response to specific tones, while contracting and dimming in response to others, are not accepted as rigorous evidence by mainstream biophysics. Kirlian photography has a complex and contested scientific status, but the patterns they document are consistent with the acoustic resonance model of cellular function, and several of Maman's specific frequency findings have since been confirmed by more rigorous methodologies. John Stuart Reid, a British acoustic engineer, invented the cimoscope, a precision instrument for visualizing the geometric forms produced by sound frequencies in water and other media, and has used it to create the most detailed and scientifically rigorous cymatic images of the Solfeggio frequencies produced to date. Reed's images of 528 Hz in water show a geometric form of extraordinary precision and beauty, a six-fold symmetrical mandala whose proportions correspond to the sacred geometric forms found in ancient temple art around the world. These images have been published in peer-reviewed acoustics journals and have attracted significant scientific interest from researchers working on the physical mechanisms of sound-matter interaction. James Gimzewski, a professor of chemistry and biochemistry at UCLA, pioneered the field of sonocytology, the study of the acoustic signatures produced by living cells. His research, using an atomic force microscope, modified to detect acoustic emissions, established that healthy cells and diseased cells produce measurably different acoustic patterns, and that exposing cells to external frequencies whose characteristics match those of healthy cell oscillation produces measurable improvements in cellular function. Gimzewski has been careful about the broader implications of his work, but the foundational claim that cellular health has an acoustic signature and that acoustic intervention can influence cellular health has been established in his laboratory with rigor that the mainstream scientific community cannot easily dismiss. Everything described in this story, the ancient tradition, the modern research, the cultural movement, the institutional resistance points toward a practical question that is ultimately the most important one. Not what happened to these frequencies, not who removed them, not what the evidence shows about their biological effects, but what can a person do about it, right now, in the life they are actually living? The answer, it turns out, is both simpler and more profound than most people expect. The most immediate and accessible entry point is passive listening. Every major streaming platform contains a significant and growing catalogue of music specifically produced at Solfeggio frequencies, compositions designed for sleep, for meditation, for relaxation, and for focused work, all tuned to the specific mathematical positions of the ancient scale, rather than to the 440 Hz standard. Listening to this music, particularly in quiet environments and through speakers rather than earphones when possible, provides the basic acoustic entrainment exposure that the research suggests is biologically beneficial. The difference between earphone listening and speaker listening is not merely one of audio quality. When sound plays through speakers in a room, the frequencies interact with the body through both the auditory system and the skin, bone, and fluid-filled cavities of the physical body, a full-body acoustic bath rather than a signal delivered only to the ears. More powerful, though less passive, is the practice of vocal toning, producing specific sustained vowel sounds that generate internal resonance at solfeggio frequencies. Every major spiritual tradition in the world includes some form of this practice. The long open vowel sounds of Gregorian chant, the bija mantras of the Vedic tradition, the dhikr practices of Sufism, the hesychast prayer tradition of Eastern Orthodox mysticism, all of these, when analyzed acoustically, involve the sustained production of vocal resonance at specific frequency targets. The human voice, when used this way, does not merely produce an external sound. It creates an internal acoustic environment, resonating the bones and fluid cavities of the skull, chest, and abdomen in ways that have measurable effects on both the nervous system and the surrounding cellular environment. The most fundamental shift, however, is the simplest, and in the modern world, perhaps the most radical: silence. Not the absence of sound, which is practically unachievable in most modern environments, but the deliberate seeking of acoustic spaces where natural resonance can be heard: forests, coastlines, stone buildings away from traffic spaces, where the body can stop defending itself against acoustic interference and begin the process of returning to its own natural frequency. The ancients built their most sacred spaces in exactly these terms. They understood that the first act of healing is always the same. You stop drowning out the sound that was always there, and you listen. In the beginning, there was sound. Not silence broken by sound, not emptiness filled with sound, but sound as the first and most fundamental expression of whatever it is that the universe is made of. This is not merely a mythological claim. It is a description, in language that the ancient world found natural and the modern world has arrived at through entirely different means, of a physical reality that astrophysics has now confirmed with the precision of mathematical modeling and satellite measurement. The cosmic microwave background radiation, the faint electromagnetic afterglow of the Big Bang that permeates all of space in every direction, is not a uniform field. It has structure. Embedded in it are acoustic oscillations, pressure waves produced in the first moments of the universe's existence, when the primordial plasma of matter and energy was dense enough to support sound wave propagation. These oscillations, frozen into the fabric of space as the universe expanded and cooled, are detectable today as minute variations in the temperature of the cosmic microwave background. They carry information about the earliest moments of time, and their frequency ratios correspond to the natural harmonic series, the same series of overtones produced by a vibrating string, a resonating air column, the voice of a trained singer in a stone cathedral. Physicists at Cambridge and Princeton, who have analyzed the acoustic structure of the cosmic microwave background, have translated these ancient pressure waves into audible sound, just as NASA scientists translated the electromagnetic emissions of the planets. What you hear is not noise. It is a chord, a deep, slowly evolving harmonic structure whose mathematical proportions correspond to the same ratios that Pythagoras identified in the vibrating string of a monochord 25 centuries ago. The universe did not merely produce sound at the beginning, it produced harmonious sound. It produced sound organized according to the same mathematical principles that govern the Solfeggio scale and every other system of musical consonants in human history. This matters for the story of the Solfeggio frequencies in a way that goes beyond the beautiful and the philosophical. It means that the mathematical structure of the ancient healing scale is not an arbitrary human invention. It is not a culturally conditioned preference or a tradition-specific convention. It is a reflection, imperfect, partial, but genuine, of the mathematical architecture of the universe itself. The people who designed the Solfeggio system were not inventing a new scale. They were recovering, from within the particular tradition they worked in, a pattern that exists in nature independently of any human culture, and encoding it in a musical form that could be used to bring the human body into resonance with that pattern. They built their cathedrals to amplify it. They trained their voices to carry it. They encoded it in the mathematical structure of their sacred texts, so that if the music was ever taken, the numbers would remain. The universe has been generating these frequencies since before the first star formed. What was suppressed was not the frequencies, it was our access to them. And access, it turns out, can always be restored. There is an experience that many people report when they hear solfeggio-tuned music for the first time. It is difficult to describe precisely, because it does not feel like the experience of encountering something new. It feels like the experience of remembering something old. The sensation is of recognition rather than discovery, as though the frequency had been waiting, not in the external world but in the body itself. And the experience of hearing it externally is simply the confirmation of something the body already knew. This sensation has a plausible biological explanation that does not require any appeal to metaphysics or past life memory. If the cells of the human body have resonant frequencies that correspond to the solfeggio tones, if the healthy oscillation of biological tissue is mathematically related to these specific frequencies, as the research in cellular acoustics suggests, then the experience of hearing those frequencies in the external environment would naturally produce a sense of recognition. The body is not encountering something foreign. It is encountering a reflection of itself. The external sound and the internal resonance are in mathematical alignment for the first time, perhaps in years or decades of acoustic diet, dominated by frequencies that do not correspond to biological health. What was lost when the solfeggio frequencies were removed from the cultural soundscape is not simply a healing tool, not merely a therapeutic modality that could be replaced by the right pharmaceutical or the right therapeutic intervention. What was lost was a daily, communal, culturally embedded practice of biological and spiritual realignment, a regular return to resonance that was woven into the fabric of ordinary life, available to everyone regardless of education or social status, requiring no specialized knowledge or individual effort beyond the act of being present in a community that practiced it. For a millennium and more, In the Christian cultures of the West, this practice took the form of attending Mass, of sitting in a stone building designed to amplify specific frequencies, listening to trained voices carry the ancient tones, allowing the body to be entrained back toward its healthy, resonant state. People did not go to Mass primarily for theology, though theology was there. They went because the body needed it, and the body knew it needed it, and the experience of the Mass produced in them a physiological state of calm, coherence, and restored balance that the week's worth of ordinary life had disturbed. When the music changed, when the tones were replaced by polyphony, when the tuning shifted, when the architecture became more decorative than acoustic, the same forms persisted, the same buildings were used, the same hours were kept, but the frequency medicine was gone, and the absence has been felt in the collective body of Western civilization ever since. The path back is not through nostalgia, and it is not through the rejection of everything that replaced the ancient system. It is through the simple, radical act of listening, of deliberately reintroducing these frequencies into the acoustic environment of daily life, and allowing the body to do what it has always known how to do, given the chance. The gap between the monastery and the operating room is smaller than it has ever been. This is not a metaphor. It is a description of the actual state of clinical research and medical practice in the 21st century, where the ancient understanding that sound frequencies have specific, measurable biological effects has arrived, by the rigorous route of experimental science, at the threshold of mainstream medical application, and where the specific frequencies of the Solfeggio tradition are closer to clinical validation than at any point since their removal from the Western musical tradition. 8 centuries ago, focused ultrasound therapy, the use of precisely directed high-frequency sound waves to produce biological effects in targeted tissues without surgical incision, is not alternative medicine. It is an active and expanding area of conventional medical research, with applications currently in clinical trials or already approved for therapeutic use that would have seemed miraculous to any physician working a generation ago. The FDA has approved focused ultrasound for the treatment of uterine fibroids, for the ablation of prostate tissue, for the destruction of certain brain tumors, and for the treatment of essential tremor through a non-invasive procedure that uses acoustic energy to modify the function of specific neural circuits. The underlying principle that sound can do precise, targeted things to biological tissue is the same principle that the Solfeggio tradition applied at lower intensities over longer timescales for systemic rather than targeted effects. Low-intensity focused ultrasound is currently being investigated as a method for opening the blood-brain barrier in a controlled and reversible way, allowing therapeutic agents to reach brain tissue that is normally protected from chemical intervention. This technology, if it reaches clinical practice, will fundamentally change the treatment of Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, and other neurological conditions for which the blood-brain barrier has historically been an insurmountable obstacle. The mechanism is acoustic. The therapeutic application is medical. The boundary between sound therapy and conventional medicine is dissolving from the conventional medicine side. Beyond these specific applications, the broader vision of personalized frequency medicine treatment protocols tailored to the specific resonant signatures of individual cells, diagnosed through acoustic scanning and delivered through precisely tuned acoustic fields, is being actively developed in research programs at major universities and technology companies. The biological reality that the Solfeggio tradition was working with, that cells have resonant frequencies, that disease alters those frequencies, and that restoring healthy resonance through acoustic intervention can support biological recovery, is not a fringe hypothesis awaiting proof. It is the foundational premise of an emerging medical technology that is receiving significant research investment from institutions that take their scientific credibility very seriously. The ancient monks did not have MRI machines or atomic force microscopes or focused ultrasound transducers. They had stone chambers, trained voices, and centuries of careful observation. They arrived at the same destination the scientists are now approaching. They simply got there first. At the end of this long journey through ancient temples and medieval monasteries, through laboratory studies and institutional suppression, through the mathematics of sacred geometry and the neuroscience of brainwave entrainment, through the political history of a tuning war that most of the world never knew, was being fought. What remains is not a neat conclusion. What remains is a question. A question that this story has been approaching from many different directions, and that now stands before us in its full dimensions, demanding to be looked at directly. Why would anyone want to suppress a system of sound frequencies that heals the body, calms the mind, reduces anxiety, supports cellular repair, synchronizes communities, and elevates consciousness toward its highest functional states? Not destroy it entirely, because as we have seen, it was not destroyed. It was obscured, diluted, mathematically dissolved, and architecturally preserved in a form that most people would never think to decode, but made inaccessible to the vast majority of the population that might otherwise have used it daily. Why would an institution, or a succession of institutions, invest significant effort and authority in making that happen? The answer that the evidence suggests is not primarily financial, though financial interests are implicated. It is not primarily political, though political power is involved. The deepest answer is this: a human being who has daily access to a practice that maintains their biological resonance, calms their nervous system, synchronizes them with their community, and regularly elevates their consciousness toward its higher states, is a human being who is substantially less easy to manage, less susceptible to fear-based control, less dependent on external authorities to regulate their internal states, less likely to accept chronic suffering as the normal condition of life, less likely to need the particular forms of institutional mediation, pharmaceutical, theological, political, that concentrated power depends on for its perpetuation. The Solfeggio system was not merely a healing tool. It was a technology of autonomy, a means by which ordinary people, without specialized knowledge, without wealth, without institutional access, could maintain the internal conditions associated with health, clarity, equanimity, and purpose. A population with daily access to that technology would be, in certain specific and important ways, more difficult to govern by the methods that have historically been most effective. And the institutions that understood what the frequencies were doing, as the MK Ultra documents confirm, the relevant institutions did understand what frequencies could do to human beings, had reasons that were, from the perspective of institutional self-preservation, entirely rational to ensure that the ancient practice did not re-establish itself in the modern world. But there is something that institutional logic cannot ultimately account for. It cannot account for the fact that the universe itself is still generating these frequencies, constantly and without interruption, in the hum of the cosmic background and the resonance of the natural world. It cannot account for the fact that the body still recognizes them, still leans toward them, still responds to them, with the unmistakable ease of something returning to its natural state. The suppression lasted 1,000 years. The frequencies lasted forever. And somewhere in the space between those two facts, between what was taken and what could never be taken, the silence that is not really silence waits, patient, resonant, ready to be heard by anyone willing to stop and listen and remember what they have always known.